Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine for a second that you find yourself right in the middle of a high-stakes debate.
Right. A really intense public one.
Exactly. You are sitting there on a stage and you confidently claim that you do not believe in God.
Okay.
But then your opponent leans in. He looks you dead in the eye and says, actually, you act like you do believe in God simply because you didn't throw the person sitting next to you off the stage.
Wow. That is quite the accusation.
It is an incredibly confrontational and heavy moment. Today's deep dive explores a fiery clash of worldviews on God, atheism, and the true foundation of morality. We are mapping out the absolute core of the secular versus religious divide.
It genuinely is one of those exchanges that forces you to pause, reevaluate your own baseline assumptions.
Totally.
Because we're looking at a deeply philosophical conversation that just bypasses all the usual superficial talking points. It gets right down to the bedrock of how human beings justify their own existence.
And before we get fully submerged in this deep dive, I want to make a quick mention. If you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. So regarding our mission today, we are navigating a transcript of a rather heavy-hitting debate between Jordan Peterson and Matt Dillahunty.
Yeah, and it's important we state our intentions clearly up front here.
Right. Worldviews are colliding in this text, but we are absolutely not taking any sides. We are not endorsing the religious framework, nor are we endorsing the atheist framework.
Our mission is strictly impartial. We are just here to extract the core arguments from both sides.
Exactly, laying them out side by side so you, the listener, can understand the profound why behind what people fundamentally believe.
Because that neutrality is vital. Our role is just to act as your guides through this complex intellectual architecture. We want to show you how these two completely different minds build their moral realities from the ground up.
Based purely on the transcript of their exchange.
Right. When you strip away the immediate emotional reactions, what you are left with is a structural blueprint of two incompatible ways of viewing human existence.
Okay, let's unpack this. The foundational disagreement that kicks off this whole debate is about the very nature of truth and how we access it.
Yeah, the epistemology of it all.
The atheist speaker lays his cards on the table early on. He asserts that he views everything through what he terms propositional reasoning.
Which basically means?
He is arguing that belief should be a state of being convinced that a specific proposition is true. Like a factual, articulable claim that is demonstrably true or at least highly likely to be true based on evidence.
He's demanding that reality be laid out logically.
Right. What's fascinating here is the immediate sharp pushback from the religious side regarding that specific lens.
The religious argument counters that you simply cannot reduce the entire world to a neat set of demonstrable propositions.
Especially not the whole human experience.
Exactly. It is a direct challenge to the atheist's method of viewing reality. The religious side argues that if you demand a world made only of literal factual claims, you inevitably lose something vital to the human condition.
They pose a very specific question in the text.
Right. If you lose religion, don't you also lose art, poetry, drama, and narrative story?
I mean, I see where they're going with that, but how does the religious side justify the leap between losing religion and losing art? Are they arguing that art is inherently religious?
They are arguing that narrative and art contain a kind of truth that cannot be quantified. You can't put it into a simple logical proposition.
Like a great novel or a moving piece of music.
Yeah, it communicates something profound about the human experience, but you can't put that truth into a mathematical equation.
So the religious framework suggests that this capacity for narrative points to something transcendent.
Right, a structure of meaning that sits above mere physical facts. By demanding only propositional logic, they argue the atheist is blinding himself to the domain where moral and religious truths actually reside.
But the atheist speaker certainly doesn't let that slide. He counters the art argument with a very specific personal anecdote.
The fan art.
Yes. He mentions a fan who came to one of his shows and handed him a drawing, something she had clearly spent a great deal of time creating.
And he admits he has no way of reading her mind.
Right, he doesn't know whether this fan believes in a god or not. But he points out the crucial detail. He doesn't believe in a god.
Yet he is fully capable of appreciating that art.
Exactly. He goes further, arguing that he could write poetry or create art himself entirely godless. He vehemently rejects the premise that access to the poetic parts of the human experience requires any sort of divine framework.
And that exchange forces you to ask yourself a very foundational question about how you process reality. Do you require a demonstrable proposition to believe something is deeply true?
Or do you find profound, undeniable truth in things that defy quantification, like the narrative arc of a story?
The religious argument maintains that these narrative truths are echoes of a divine order.
While the secular argument maintains that human beings are perfectly capable of generating and finding deep personal meaning in art without needing a supernatural source.
It is an emergent property of our biology, not a gift from above.
Which brings us to a moment in the transcript that completely shifts the tone of the room.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh yeah, the stage moment.
The religious side makes an incredibly provocative claim. They tell the atheist, you say, you don't believe in God, but you act like you do.
And the proof they offer is sitting right next to them.
Sam Harris.
Right. The religious side says you didn't throw Sam off the stage.
Mm.
The core of the argument here is that the atheist actually possesses a moral sense.
And that moral sense betrays a hidden underlying belief in something divine.
We need to linger on the philosophical maneuver happening here because it is the crux of the entire religious argument.
The proposition is that treating another human being as an implicitly valuable entity requires a massive metaphysical framework. The religious side is pressing the atheist on the Izot problem. If there is no God, if we are all just biological matter floating in an indifferent physical universe, then why is any collection of atoms intrinsically valuable?
Why shouldn't you push him off the stage if it benefits you?
Right. The religious speaker is asserting you treated Sam with respect. You didn't harm him. Therefore, you are acting as if he has sacred implicit value.
Which directly contradicts his stated claim that there is no higher moral architecture governing the universe.
So they were essentially accusing him of smuggling in a Christian, or at least a theistic moral ethic, while denying the source of it.
But the atheist's response doesn't concede that ground at all. He offers a purely secular, almost brutally pragmatic defense.
He doesn't claim that Sam has some glowing aura of divine worth.
No, instead he argues that morality can be founded entirely on self-interest. It is a social contract model.
He explicitly states that he didn't throw Sam off the stage because he doesn't want to be thrown off the stage.
He doesn't want his own belongings stolen. Therefore, it is in his enlightened self-interest to not steal from others,
To foster mutual respect, and to work cooperatively with society to punish those who do throw people off stages.
It is essential to look at this impartially and recognize the vast chasm between these two viewpoints.
On one side, you have a worldview that insists true morality demands an overarching divine framework. It argues that human beings must possess an implicit metaphysical value bestowed upon them.
Otherwise, the whole concept of human rights collapses into mere opinion.
Exactly. On the other side, you have a worldview that views morality as a pragmatic evolutionary social contract. The secular view presented here doesn't require humans to have intrinsic cosmic value.
It just requires a mutual practical agreement that we all prefer not to suffer harm. So what does this all mean? Like, for the concept of well-being?
That's the key term.
Because well-being is heavily relied upon by the secular side in this text as the ultimate North Star for morality. The atheist side references Sam Harris's framework.
Talking about how the goal of society should be working to maximize well-being, or perhaps more accurately, minimizing the suffering of conscious creatures.
They treat this as the self-evident foundation of their ethical worldview.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can see exactly how the atheist views the mechanics of reality. The argument presented is that we are purely physical beings existing inside a purely physical universe.
Because of that materialist reality, the physical laws of this universe are the ultimate arbiters of what is or isn't in our best interest.
Our biology, our neurology, and the laws of physics dictate our well-being. It is not an abstract spiritual concept.
It's tied directly to our physical states. And the religious side immediately finds a pressure point in that materialist perspective by bringing up free will.
They challenge the atheist on agency.
Right. If the rigid laws of a physical universe are dictating everything that happens and dictating our biology, why do you even need to attribute agency or moral responsibility to human beings?
And the atheist responds with a very blunt, visceral analogy.
He says, if you chop off my head, that is clearly not good for me, and it doesn't matter whether it was an act of free will or my lawnmower.
It is a striking image.
It is. He is basically saying that harm is harm. A severed head is objectively bad for his physical well-being, regardless of the philosophical mechanics behind how it happened.
He doesn't need a metaphysical theory of free will to know that getting decapitated is a negative outcome for a biological organism.
But we have to examine the religious side's sharp rebuttal to that analogy because this is where the deeper metaphysical trap is sprung.
The religious argument fires back. that it is only not good if you first presuppose that you are a valuable entity worth preserving.
To the religious speaker, looking at a severed head and declaring that is bad is not some undeniable objective fact of the universe.
It is a metaphysical presupposition.
Wait, so the religious argument is that the universe itself has no opinion on the severed head.
Precisely. A universe composed entirely of dead matter and physical forces does not care if a head is attached to a body or separated from it.
It is just a rearrangement of carbon atoms.
To claim that the rearrangement is morally bad requires you to smuggle in a definition of value that a purely physical universe simply does not provide.
It depends entirely on how you define well-being.
And the religious side argues you cannot get a moral ought from a physical is without appealing to something beyond the physical.
That is a heavy counterpunch. They are demanding that the atheist explain why human life has value in the first place, rather than just pointing to biological survival and assuming we all agree it's good.
And that forces the atheist to explain why he believes he is worth preserving without appealing to a creator.
And his answer leans entirely on evolutionary biology. He states that he is valuable and feels he is worth preserving because he is descended from people who thought they were valuable.
It is a fascinating application of natural selection to the concept of self-worth. The atheist is arguing that the feeling of having value is an inherited survival mechanism.
But does that actually answer the religious critique?
Well, he is arguing that his ancestors who believed they had value fought to survive, reproduced, and passed down that instinct.
And the ancestors who didn't think they had value, who didn't care about their own well-being, simply allowed themselves to die and were removed from the gene pool.
So the drive to preserve life isn't a divine spark. It is just a biological trait selected by evolution.
But pointing out how we developed a survival instinct doesn't necessarily prove that our survival is objectively good, does it?
That is exactly the friction point, and it brings us to a surprisingly rare moment of agreement in this dense text.
As they push these arguments to their absolute limits, both the atheist and the religious speaker eventually acknowledge that defining well-being objectively is incredibly difficult.
More importantly, they both concede that valuing well-being is at its core a subjective preference.
The atheist openly admits that there are people who are going to care about human well-being, and there are people who simply aren't.
They do not possess a magical, scientifically objective definition of how to live a perfectly moral life that applies universally in the same way the law of gravity does.
That feels like a massive concession. But they still clash over the absolute baseline of that subjective preference. The atheist attempts to anchor his secular morality by arguing that you have to start with some basic foundational assumptions.
He suggests, starting with the foundation, that life is preferable to death.
On the surface, it seems like the most basic, undeniable assumption a living conscious creature could make.
You would certainly think so. But the religious pushback in the transcript is relentless on this point. They refuse to grant even that foundational premise.
They argue that even the statement life is preferable to death is not self-evident in a purely material universe.
The religious side points out a logical alternative. One could easily argue that death is actually preferable to life, because death immediately and permanently stops all suffering.
That takes a remarkably dark turn. But I see the logic. If the atheist's ultimate goal is simply minimizing the suffering of conscious creatures, then ceasing to exist entirely is technically the most efficient way to achieve that goal.
No consciousness means no suffering.
Exactly. It forces the atheist to defend why existence itself is better than non-existence.
And the atheist gets the final word on this specific thread in the source material. He counters the death stops suffering argument by pointing out a flaw in the phrasing.
He argues that when you are dead, you are no longer being. Therefore, the whole concept of well-being vanishes entirely.
You cannot experience the absence of suffering because you do not exist to experience anything at all.
So if you are looking to maximize the positive aspects of life, you logically cannot say that death is a better state because death isn't a state of being.
It is a fascinating logical loop.
And this entire exchange really invites you to step back and interrogate your own deeply held assumptions. When you look at the world and you declare that an action is good or bad for humanity, what are you actually basing that judgment on?
Are you basing it purely on the physical survival and inherited biological preferences of our species, as the secular argument suggests?
Or are you basing it on a deeper, perhaps unprovable, but deeply felt belief in the implicit sanctity and narrative value of human beings?
It is a question that doesn't offer an easy exit.
To recap the gridlock we've explored today, on one hand, you are presented with a worldview where morality is a pragmatic evolutionary byproduct.
It is a system based entirely on physical well-being, biological inheritance, and enlightened self-interest.
It is a world where you don't throw someone off a stage simply because it violates a social contract designed to keep you safe.
And on the other hand, you have a worldview insisting that treating humans as valuable entities requires an implicit metaphysical narrative.
It argues that physical laws and biological evolution alone cannot generate objective morality.
And that without a higher framework, you cannot even philosophically justify why human life is worth preserving in the first place.
And again, it is important to reiterate our impartiality as we close. The goal of this deep dive was never to declare a victor between the religious and atheistic perspectives.
Our objective was to expose the foundational architecture of how these different minds build their moral realities.
We wanted to show you the blueprints of these two distinct ways of interpreting the human experience drawn directly from their own words and arguments.
And we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Something that builds on the tension we've discussed today. If secular well-being is at its absolute core a subjective preference, and humanity's drive to survive is just a biological evolutionary trait inherited from ancestors who managed not to die.
What happens when a society's pragmatic self-interest shifts?
Exactly. What happens when a society logically decides that the well-being of a few should be entirely sacrificed to maximize the well-being of the many?
If the physical universe truly doesn't care about implicit intrinsic value, could a purely secular pragmatic framework eventually be used to justify actions that we currently instinctively feel are evil, simply because it mathematically benefits the survival of the larger group?
It is a heavy question, but an essential one when you examine the foundations of what we believe. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep thinking deeper.